They dazzled us on the silver screen, portrayed icons of glamour and beauty, and stood as giants of Hollywood's golden age. But the industry's biggest illusion wasn't just in the stories they told. It was hiding just how tiny these legendary stars actually were. From 4'11" powerhouses who commanded entire studios to leading ladies who needed apple boxes just to kiss their co-stars, these diminutive divas proved that in Hollywood, stature was measured in star power, not inches. Prepare to be shocked at how these screen goddesses truly measured up. 1. Judy Garland. Judy Garland's soaring voice and raw emotional power made her one of Hollywood's most unforgettable performers. Yet the star who broke our hearts in A Star is Born and skipped down the yellow brick road in The Wizard of Oz stood at a mere 4'11". MGM executives were so obsessed with her tiny stature that they forced the teenage Garland to wear painful metal discs in her nose and caps on her teeth to reshape her face into something they considered more proportional to her height. The studio's fixation on her size bordered on cruelty. Louis B. Mayer himself nicknamed her My Little Hunchback, while studio nutritionists restricted her to chicken soup and black coffee to keep her childlike frame. For romantic scenes with taller co-stars like James Mason, Garland stood on hidden platforms that crew members nicknamed Judy boards. Cinematographers developed special lighting techniques that elongated her shadow, creating a subliminal impression of greater height. Yet what Garland lacked in inches, she made up for in sheer talent. Director George Cukor marveled, "When she sings, she grows 10 feet tall." Her distinctive vibrato and emotional transparency created such commanding presence that audiences completely forgot her diminutive dimensions. Fellow actor Dirk Bogarde once observed, "Judy wasn't a star, she was an entire galaxy packed into a tiny frame." Off camera, Garland eventually embraced her petite proportions with self-deprecating humor. "I've always taken up very little physical space," she once quipped, "but an awful lot of emotional real estate." 2. Veronica Lake. Veronica Lake's smoldering sexuality and mysterious peekaboo blonde waves made her the ultimate film noir temptress of the 1940s. Yet the woman who drove Alan Ladd to distraction in classics like This Gun for Hire and The Blue Dahlia measured a minuscule 4'11", barely tall enough to reach the top shelf in her dressing room without assistance. Lake's diminutive stature wasn't just coincidental to her pairing with Alan Ladd, himself a notoriously short actor at 5'6". It was a strategic casting move by Paramount executives who desperately needed an actress who wouldn't tower over their male star. Director George Marshall admitted years later, "We could shoot them together without any camera tricks. Their chemistry was real, but their matching heights were pure Hollywood calculation." Lake's trademark hairstyle, the sensual wave that fell over one eye, wasn't just a fashion statement. It was a clever visual distraction that drew the eye upward and created the illusion of a longer, leaner silhouette. Costume designers emphasized her tiny 21-inch waist with high-waisted pencil skirts and vertical seaming that visually stretched her petite frame. Off-screen, Lake refused to be defined by her measurements. When a reporter tactlessly asked if she felt disadvantaged by her height, she famously snapped, "I'm exactly the same size as Napoleon, and he conquered Europe." Her refusal to limit herself extended to her personal life. She obtained a pilot's license and flew solo cross-country at a time when female aviators were rare. As film historian Eddie Muller noted, Lake turned her small stature into mystique. When every other actress was trying to appear larger than life, she cultivated an intimate, almost conspiratorial screen presence that made the audience lean in closer. 3. Gloria Swanson. Gloria Swanson didn't just command the silent era, she owned it. The star who later immortalized faded greatness as Norma Desmond in Sunset Boulevard built her empire standing just 5'1" tall. But what she lacked in height, she made up for in sheer imperious presence that made directors, studio heads, and co-stars bow to her will. Swanson's height deception wasn't subtle. It was architectural. On the sets of epics like Queen Kelly and Sadie Thompson, carpenters constructed special staircases with shortened risers that gave her legs the appearance of greater length when she made her grand entrances. Costume designer Howard Greer created her signature turbans and dramatic headpieces that added valuable vertical inches to her silhouette. Director Cecil B. DeMille, who worked with Swanson on 6 films, developed what crew members called the Swanson shot, a low-angle camera position that turned the diminutive actress into a towering figure of glamour and authority. For love scenes, male co-stars were often positioned seated or reclining while Swanson remained standing to maintain her dominance in the frame. The actress embraced her smaller stature with characteristic extravagance, reportedly saying, "I may be small, but I think big. That's why they built the sets around me, not the other way around." Her lavish taste extended to her famous shoe collection, each pair custom-made with 3-inch hidden platforms inside deceptively normal-looking heels. Film historian Kevin Brownlow observed, Swanson commanded space not through physical size, but through absolute certainty. When she entered a room on screen, the audience felt her presence before they registered her height. This magnetic quality made her transition from silent star to Sunset Boulevard so effective. Even in her 50s, the 5'1" actress could still dominate a screen through sheer force of personality. 4. Mary Pickford. Mary Pickford wasn't just an actress, she was the first female mogul of Hollywood, co-founding United Artists while standing just 5 feet tall in her stocking feet. America's sweetheart leveraged her petite proportions into an unprecedented career, playing children and teenagers well into her 30s, becoming the highest-paid woman in the world at the peak of her fame. Pickford's small stature became her greatest asset in the silent era. For films like Little Lord Fauntleroy and Poor Little Rich Girl, set designers created oversized furniture and doorways that made her appear even smaller on screen, enhancing the illusion that she was a child rather than a grown woman. Co-stars were often cast specifically for their height, with Pickford demanding actors over 6 feet to maximize the visual contrast. Her famous golden curls weren't just a style choice, they were a calculated element of her height deception. The voluminous ringlets created the proportions of a child's head on an adult body, completing the visual trickery that fooled audiences for decades. Cinematographer Charles Rosher developed specialized lighting techniques that softened Pickford's mature features while emphasizing her diminutive frame. When Pickford finally attempted to transition to adult roles in talkies like Coquette, for which she won an Oscar, the illusion shattered. Audiences couldn't reconcile the sophisticated adult voice with the tiny woman they'd associated with childhood for so long. As film historian Eileen Whitfield noted, Pickford's career was built on a paradox. Her small size allowed her to play children, but ultimately trapped her in eternal youth. Douglas Fairbanks, her husband and America's action hero at 5'10", reportedly had platforms built into their home so Pickford could reach countertops and shelves without assistance. Yet, in their business partnership, her stature never limited her power. As director Cecil B. DeMille observed, Mary might have been the smallest person in the boardroom, but she was always the largest presence. 5. Elizabeth Taylor. Elizabeth Taylor's legendary beauty launched 1,000 headlines, 8 marriages, and a jewelry collection that required its own security team. Yet, the woman who commanded million-dollar salaries and went toe-to-toe with Richard Burton's Shakespearean intensity stood at a mere 5'2". The star of epics like Cleopatra and intimate dramas like Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf was Hollywood's most powerful pint-sized package. Taylor's height management on screen was a masterclass in illusion. MGM developed Taylor trenches, actual ditches dug into studio floors where taller co-stars would stand during close-ups, giving the impression that Taylor was matching their height eye to eye. For Giant, where she was dramatically shorter than co-stars Rock Hudson, a 6'5", and James Dean, 5'8". Director George Stevens had special platforms constructed that could be quickly wheeled in for Taylor's close-ups. Her famous hourglass figure, 36-21-36 at her peak, created proportions so perfect that her height became irrelevant. Costume designer Edith Head noted, Elizabeth's body was so ideally proportioned that she appeared taller on screen than in person. The first time people met her, they were always shocked by how small she actually was. Taylor's footwear became legendary in Hollywood. Her custom-made shoes contained hidden 3-inch platforms within seemingly modest 1-inch heels, a trick so effective that her height fluctuated mysteriously in publicity photos depending on what she was wearing. Makeup artists even developed contouring techniques for her jawline and neck that created the illusion of a longer silhouette. Director Joseph L. Mankiewicz, who worked with Taylor on Suddenly Last Summer and Cleopatra, observed, "Elizabeth's physical presence isn't about inches, it's about impact. When she locks those violet eyes on you, you forget measurements entirely." Her diminutive stature did nothing to diminish her legendary temper either. As Richard Burton famously quipped, "Elizabeth may be a tiny woman, but her rage is 6 feet tall." 6. Natalie Wood. Natalie Wood didn't just defy Hollywood's height obsession, she turned it into dramatic gold. Standing exactly 5'0", the star who grew up before America's eyes in Miracle on 34th Street, before breaking hearts in Rebel Without a Cause and Splendor in the Grass, used her compact intensity to dominate scenes with much taller co-stars. For Rebel Without a Cause, director Nicholas Ray specifically used Wood's height differential with James Dean, 5'5", to heighten the emotional dynamics between their characters. The physical contrast emphasized her vulnerability while making her emotional outbursts even more impactful. Cinematographer Ernest Haller developed lighting techniques that cast Wood's shadow larger than her actual size, creating a subliminal impression of greater presence. Wood's wardrobe became a critical component of her height management. Costume designer Howard Shoup created the iconic red jacket from Rebel Without a Cause, with vertical seaming and an elevated waistline that visually extended Wood's torso. For formal scenes in films like West Side Story, her dancing pumps contained custom 3-inch lifts that allowed her to appear more proportional alongside the 5'8" Richard Beymer. Despite these tricks, directors often incorporated Wood's small stature into characterization rather than disguising it. Director Elia Kazan, who guided Wood to an Oscar nomination for Splendor in the Grass, noted, "Natalie's size makes her emotional fragility more believable. When she breaks down, it's like watching a small, perfect object shatter. The impact is greater because of her scale." Wood herself was remarkably unconcerned with height conventions. She famously dated much taller men, including six-poyu Robert Wagner, whom she married twice. When asked about the height difference, she reportedly quipped, "I don't notice the distance when you're lying down, everyone's the same height." Film historian David Thompson observed, "Wood's performances had an intensity inversely proportional to her physical size. She could communicate more genuine emotion with a glance than actresses twice her height could with their entire bodies." 7. Debbie Reynolds. Debbie Reynolds didn't walk into a room, she exploded into it. The star of Singin' in the Rain and the unsinkable Molly Brown packed more energy into her 5'2" frame than performers twice her size. What she lacked in inches, she made up for with a smile that could power Las Vegas and dancing skills that left taller co-stars breathless trying to keep up. MGM initially worried about Reynolds' height when casting her opposite the 5'8" Gene Kelly in Singin' in the Rain. The solution? An excruciating regimen of dance rehearsals, up to 14 hours daily, where Reynolds learned to stretch her movements to create the illusion of greater length. Costume designer Walter Plunkett created her wardrobe with strategic vertical lines that visually extended her small frame. For the famous Good Morning number, Reynolds wore specially designed shoes with 3-inch hidden platforms that allowed her to match the stride length of Kelly and Donald O'Connor. The physical toll was enormous. Reynolds later revealed that she broke blood vessels in her feet during filming and had to be carried to her dressing room after some dance sequences. Director Stanley Donen developed what crew members called the Reynolds Rise, a subtle camera movement that began at her feet and traveled upward, creating the impression of height through vertical motion. For intimate scenes, Kelly would be positioned slightly downhill, or Reynolds would stand on hidden risers, techniques that became standard for her later films with taller co-stars. Reynolds' height belied her physical strength and stamina. For the unsinkable Molly Brown, she performed stunts that stuntmen found challenging, leading director Charles Walters to remark, "Pound for pound, Debbie might be the strongest performer in Hollywood. She has the energy of 3 people packed into that tiny body." Unlike stars who were sensitive about their stature, Reynolds incorporated her height into her comedy. In performances with 6'1" Jimmy Stewart, she would occasionally leap into his arms unexpectedly, turning their height difference into a visual punchline. As co-star Donald O'Connor observed, "Debbie's not small. She just comes in a more concentrated package than the rest of us." 8. June Allyson. June Allyson's wholesome charm and distinctive husky voice made her MGM's quintessential girl next door in the 1940s and 50s. Yet the star of Little Women and The Glenn Miller Story stood at just 5'1", a height that required careful management when paired with leading men like 6'3" Jimmy Stewart and 6'1" Van Johnson. Allyson's height deception began with her famous hairstyle, a short, bouncy pageboy cut that created the illusion of a longer neck and added valuable vertical inches to her silhouette. Costume designer Irene Lentz developed special proportioning for Allyson's wardrobe, using high-waisted trousers and strategically placed seams that visually stretched her compact frame. For scenes with particularly tall co-stars, MGM employed what became known as Allyson alts, custom-built platforms hidden behind furniture or concealed beneath rugs that allowed her to maintain eye contact with taller actors. Director Richard Thorpe, who worked with Allyson on several films, developed a distinctive blocking style where Allyson would remain standing while male co-stars would be seated, creating the impression of equal height through careful composition. Her physical shortness became part of her appeal, the perfect embodiment of the non-threatening, approachable girl that male viewers could imagine taking home to meet their mothers. Studio publicists described her as pocket-sized perfection, turning her stature into a marketing advantage rather than a limitation. What made Allyson unique was how her height influenced her performance style. She developed a distinctive perky energy and quick-step walk that became her trademark. Choreographer Charles Walters, who worked with Allyson on Two Girls and a Sailor, observed, "June moves like she's always catching up to someone taller, which gives her this wonderful enthusiastic quality. She doesn't just walk into a scene, she bounces." Despite her diminutive stature, Allyson projected remarkable strength in dramatic scenes. Director Mervyn LeRoy, who guided her through Executive Suite, noted, "When June plants her feet and stands her ground, she somehow seems bigger than everyone around her. It's not about physical size, it's about conviction." 9. Audrey Hepburn. Audrey Hepburn wasn't actually extremely short. At 5'7", she was taller than many actresses of her era. Yet the star of Roman Holiday and Breakfast at Tiffany's created Hollywood's most enduring height illusion. The perception that she was a delicate, fragile wisp when in reality her height was above average for women of the 1950s. Hepburn's ballet training and extremely slender frame, she never weighed more than 110 pounds throughout her career, created such an impression of ethereal delicacy that audiences and even co-stars consistently described her as tiny and childlike. Designer Hubert de Givenchy, who created her most iconic costumes, deliberately emphasized this quality with narrow silhouettes that accentuated her slenderness rather than her height. Director William Wyler, who introduced Hepburn to American audiences in Roman Holiday, capitalized on this visual contradiction. He would frame shots to emphasize her slender proportions while using camera angles that minimized her actual height next to the 6'1" Gregory Peck. The perception of Hepburn as small became so prevalent that Peck himself later referred to her as "that lovely little thing." Despite their modest 6-inch height difference, Hepburn's unique proportions, extremely narrow shoulders, tiny 20-inch waist, and long legs created a physical presence that confused the eye. Costume designers dressed her in ways that emphasized these unusual proportions, making her appear simultaneously taller and more fragile than she actually was. Her famous pixie haircut in Roman Holiday further reinforced the impression of delicacy. Hepburn herself contributed to the illusion with her distinctive movement style, quick bird-like gestures, and an almost balletic gait that made her seem to float rather than walk. Director Stanley Donen, who worked with Hepburn on Funny Face, observed, "Audrey moves like someone much smaller than she is. She has the grace of a much more petite woman, which makes her height almost invisible on screen." The ultimate irony of Hepburn's career is that while she stood taller than Elizabeth Taylor, Marilyn Monroe, and many of her contemporaries, she became the enduring symbol of fragile femininity. As fashion historian Richard Martin noted, Hepburn created the ultimate optical illusion. She was a woman of above-average height who convinced the world she was as delicate as a fairy. 10. Marlene Dietrich. Marlene Dietrich didn't just challenge Hollywood's height expectations, she demolished them entirely. The German-born star of The Blue Angel and Morocco stood at a modest 5'4". Yet, through sheer force of presence and theatrical genius, she created an image of towering, intimidating glamour that made her seem 7 feet tall on screen. Dietrich's height illusion began with her infamous discipline. She slept with wool cloths wrapped around her cheeks to maintain sharp cheekbones and followed a near-starvation diet to maintain her angular silhouette. For scenes requiring extra height, she developed a distinctive straight-backed posture that made her appear taller than co-stars who actually exceeded her height. Her collaboration with director Joseph von Sternberg produced cinema's most effective height deception. Through a combination of strategic lighting that cast elongated shadows, low camera angles that created the impression of looking up at a goddess, and elaborate headdresses that added vertical inches, von Sternberg transformed Dietrich into a figure of imposing stature on screen. Dietrich's famous androgynous styling, men's tailored suits with strong shoulders and high-waisted trousers, wasn't just fashion innovation, it was calculated height management. Costume designer Travis Banton created suits with exaggerated vertical lines that visually stretched Dietrich's frame. Her trademark wide-legged trousers were cut specifically to create an illusion of longer legs. Her movements became part of the illusion. Dietrich developed a distinctive way of holding herself, chin slightly raised, shoulders back, spine perfectly straight, that made her appear taller than her actual height. This rigid posture became so associated with her that comedians often parodied it, with Bob Hope once joking that Marlene Dietrich is so stiff, she makes statues look like they need chiropractic adjustment. Unlike many stars who were defensive about height, Dietrich weaponized hers. Director Billy Wilder, who worked with her on A Foreign Affair, observed, "Marlene doesn't try to seem taller, she makes everyone else in the room feel smaller." This confidence extended to her personal style. She famously wore flat shoes when the occasion allowed, saying, "I don't need extra inches. My presence does the work for me." 11. Clara Bow. Clara Bow exploded onto the silent screen like a firecracker, her vibrant energy and uninhibited sensuality making her Hollywood's definitive it girl. Yet the woman who revolutionized female sexuality on screen and reportedly received 45,000 fan letters in a single month stood at a mere 5'3". Bow's diminutive stature became part of her appeal, a compact package of pure dynamism that seemed to vibrate with energy. Unlike stars who tried to disguise their height, Paramount's publicity department leaned into Bow's petite proportions, describing her as pint-sized passion and concentrated allure in fan magazines. Director Victor Fleming, who directed Bow in Man Trap, observed, "Clara doesn't need height to fill the frame. She generates more energy standing still than most actresses do running a marathon." For romantic scenes with taller leading men, cinematographers developed what became known as the Bow glow, a distinctive soft-focus lighting technique that created a hazy, dreamlike quality that minimized obvious height differences. The technique became so associated with Bow that other actresses demanded similar treatment, changing Hollywood's visual aesthetic. Costume designer Travis Banton created Bow's iconic flapper looks with vertical beading and dropped waistlines that elongated her torso. For scenes requiring additional height, Bow wore specially designed shoes with platform soles concealed beneath fashionable Mary Jane styles. The effect allowed her to appear taller without sacrificing the youthful energy that defined her screen persona. What made Bow's height management unique was her frenetic movement style. Unlike stars who remained relatively static to maintain height illusions, Bow was constantly in motion, bouncing, dancing, or fidgeting with expressive energy. This perpetual movement became her trademark, drawing the eye so completely that height comparisons became irrelevant. Film historian Kevin Brownlow noted, "Bow didn't fight her small stature. She used it to enhance her appeal as the quintessential flapper. Her compact frame made her seem more modern, more youthful, and more accessible than the statuesque stars who preceded her. This accessibility was key to her unprecedented popularity with female fans, who could imagine themselves in her place more easily than with taller, more imposing stars. Tragically, Bow's career didn't survive the transition to sound, but her influence on screen sexuality proved enormous. As director Frank Capra observed, Clara packed more raw charisma into her little frame than the rest of Hollywood combined. Size didn't matter. That indefinable it did. 12. Janet Leigh. Janet Leigh's blood-curdling screams in Psycho are forever etched into cinema history. Her brutal shower scene death-changing horror movies forever. Yet the actress who created one of film's most iconic moments stood at a modest 5'5", a height that required careful management when paired with leading men like Charlton Heston, 3, and Tony Curtis, 5'9". Alfred Hitchcock specifically exploited Leigh's smaller stature in Psycho to enhance her vulnerability. The infamous shower scene was shot in a deliberately cramped space that emphasized her petite frame against the looming shadow of her attacker. Hitchcock told cinematographer John L. Russell, "Make her look small, trapped like a bird in a cage. It will make the violence more shocking." For earlier glamour roles in films like Touch of Evil and The Manchurian Candidate, Universal Studios employed various height-enhancing techniques. Costume designer Edith Head created wardrobes with strong vertical elements and high-waisted silhouettes that visually lengthened Leigh's torso. For scenes with particularly tall co-stars, Leigh would stand on hidden platforms that crew members nicknamed Leigh Ledges. Leigh's height management extended to her off-screen persona. Studio publicity photos were carefully staged with Leigh positioned on stairs or slightly elevated surfaces to create a more imposing silhouette. Portraits were shot from low angles that elongated her neck and created the impression of greater height. Unlike some stars who were defensive about their stature, Leigh incorporated her size into her performance style, particularly in thrillers. Director John Frankenheimer, who worked with Leigh on The Manchurian Candidate, noted, "Janet uses her smaller stature strategically. When she needs to appear vulnerable, she seems to physically shrink. When her character needs strength, she expands her presence through sheer force of will." Leigh's most effective height illusion came through her distinctive voice, clear, commanding, and capable of projecting authority regardless of physical stature. Voice coach Florence Cunningham, who worked with many MGM stars, observed, "Janet has the voice of a much larger woman. When she speaks, you forget any physical dimensions and simply respond to the authority in her tone." Her marriage to the 5'9". Tony Curtis created Hollywood's perfect height-compatible couple, though later pairings with taller actors presented challenges. As Leigh herself once quipped, "In Hollywood, it's not the height of your career that matters, it's how you're framed in relation to your leading man." 13. Vivien Leigh. Vivien Leigh didn't just play indomitable Southern belle. Scarlett O'Hara in Gone with the Wind, she embodied that same determination in her career. Standing just 5'3", the British actress dominated Hollywood's most epic production and won 2 Oscars despite being told repeatedly she was too small for stardom. For Gone with the Wind, producer David O. Selznick initially rejected Leigh for the role of Scarlett, telling director George Cukor, "She's too delicate, too small to carry the weight of this production." After seeing her screen test, however, he changed his tune, ordering set designers to create special platforms and staircases that would enhance Leigh's stature against the 6'4" Clark Gable. Costume designer Walter Plunkett created Scarlett's iconic wardrobe with vertical seaming, elevated waistlines, and structured shoulders that visually stretched Leigh's petite frame. Her famous 17-inch corseted waist created such dramatic proportions that height became a secondary consideration. For the scene where Scarlett shoots the Union soldier, Leigh stood on an 8-inch platform that remained out of frame, giving her the commanding presence the scene required. Director Victor Fleming used what cinematographers called forced perspective, a technique where the camera angle and object placement created the illusion that Leigh was taller than her actual height. For scenes with Gable, Fleming frequently positioned Leigh on stairs or had her standing while Gable sat to minimize their dramatic height difference. Leigh's second Oscar-winning role as Blanche Dubois in A Streetcar Named Desire required different height management. Director Elia Kazan deliberately emphasized the physical contrast between the petite Leigh and the imposing Marlon Brando to heighten the power dynamics between their characters. Kazan later wrote, "Her smallness next to Brando's bulk made her emotional fragility more credible and her eventual destruction more devastating." What made Leigh exceptional was her ability to project different heights depending on the character's emotional state. Laurence Olivier, her husband and frequent co-star, observed, "Vivien could seem 6 feet tall when playing queens and 5 feet nothing when playing victims. Her physical transformation was complete. She could expand or contract her presence at will." This chameleon-like quality extended to her voice, which could shift from authoritative command to vulnerable whisper depending on the role's requirements. As director George Cukor noted, Vivien might be small in stature, but when she speaks, the audience hangs on every word. That kind of power has nothing to do with physical dimensions. 14. Betty Grable. Betty Grable's legendary legs were insured by Lloyd's of London for $1 million, the ultimate validation that her 5'4" frame contained the most valuable limbs in Hollywood. The star, whose pinup was the most requested image by American GIs during World War II, turned modesty height into an asset that earned her the title of highest paid woman in America by 1947. 20th Century Fox built an entire musical empire around Grable's compact proportions. Choreographer Hermes Pan designed dance numbers that emphasized her famous legs while minimizing full-body shots that would reveal her height next to taller chorus members. For Moon Over Miami and Coney Island, director Walter Lang developed a distinctive visual style where the camera would begin on Grable's feet and slowly pan upward, creating the impression of greater height through movement. Costume designer Renee Hubert created Grable's signature look, high-waisted shorts and midriff-bearing tops, specifically to elongate her legs while drawing attention away from her modest height. Her famous backwards glance pinup pose was carefully composed to create diagonal lines that visually stretched her silhouette. For scenes with taller leading men like 6'0", Victor Mature and 6'3" John Payne, Fox employed various height-enhancing techniques. Grable wore specially designed platform shoes that added 3 to 4 inches of height while appearing to be standard heels from the front. Sets were built with subtle inclines that allowed Grable to stand higher than her co-stars without obvious camera tricks. Unlike many stars who were defensive about their dimensions, Grable approached her height with characteristic good humor. When asked about being shorter than some of her leading ladies, she reportedly quipped, "Honey, they didn't hire me for my height. They hired me for my circumference." This comfort with her body made her an ideal pinup, approachable, relatable, and seemingly attainable. Director Bruce Humberstone, who worked with Grable on several films, observed, "Betty doesn't fight her height. She works with it. She moves like a compact sports car rather than a luxury sedan, quick and nimble and always catching the eye." This distinctive movement style became part of her appeal, giving her dance numbers an energy and precision taller performers couldn't match. As cultural historian Richard Griffith noted, Grable's modest height may have been her greatest asset. Unlike intimidating Amazons, she seemed accessible to the average GI, the pretty girl next door rather than an unattainable goddess. This accessibility made her America's favorite wartime fantasy and one of Hollywood's most bankable stars. 15. Ginger Rogers. Ginger Rogers didn't just match Fred Astaire step for step in their legendary dance partnership. She did it despite standing a full 3 inches shorter than him in her stocking feet. The actress, whose grace and precision made her half of Hollywood's greatest dance team, overcame her modest 5'4" height through technical brilliance, concealed lifts, and sheer determination. RKO's engineering department developed specialized dance shoes for Rogers that contained hidden 3-inch platforms within what appeared to be standard 1-inch heels. These technical marvels allowed her to match Astaire's stride length and eye level without compromising the seamless flow of their dance routines. Costume designer Bernard Newman created Rogers' iconic feathered dresses with vertical panels and bias cuts that created an illusion of greater height through movement. Directors Mark Sandrich and George Stevens developed camera techniques specifically to manage the height differential between Rogers and Astaire. Dance sequences were often shot from a low angle that minimized obvious height comparisons, while sets were built with subtle elevation changes that kept Rogers on slightly higher ground during stationary dialogue scenes. What made Rogers' height management revolutionary was how it influenced her dance technique. Unlike stationary actors who could rely on static props and camera angles, Rogers had to maintain her height illusion while in constant motion. She developed a distinctive upright posture and elongated neck position that created the impression of greater height even during complex dance moves. Astaire himself recognized Rogers' technical achievement, reportedly telling choreographer Hermes Pan, "Ginger has to work twice as hard as I do. She has to maintain perfect form while compensating for our height difference in every step." This extra challenge made her accomplishment even more remarkable, not only keeping pace with Astaire's legendary perfectionism, but doing so with the additional burden of height management. Rogers' height became an unexpected asset in her dramatic roles after leaving the dance partnership. Director Billy Wilder, who directed her in The Major and the Minor, observed, "Ginger can seem girlish or commanding depending on what the scene requires. Her height is flexible in a way taller actresses can't achieve. She can physically transform herself through pure performance." As dance historian Arlene Croce noted, what made Rogers extraordinary wasn't that she overcame her height difference with Astaire, it's that she made the audience completely forget it existed. When they danced, you saw only the perfect union of movement, not the technical adjustments happening with every step. In a Hollywood obsessed with physical dimensions, these 15 diminutive divas proved that true star power had nothing to do with inches. Through technical innovation, costume wizardry, and sheer force of talent, they commanded screens and conquered hearts, despite standing eye level with the average teenage girl. Their legacy forces us to question, in today's height-obsessed culture, would any of these legendary performers even be considered for leading roles? Or have we lost something precious by focusing on physical measurements over that indefinable star quality that made these small women into towering legends of the silver screen?